In terms of the history of the Tax Resistance League, I think it's quite helpful. I'm not a suffrage scholar, but I think it's helpful just to put it in a little bit of context. Most people with the suffrage movement seem to start in 1866 with the first mass petition of women to Parliament presented by John Stuart Mill asking for the right to vote. What I find interesting is the first individual petition by Mary Smith of Stanhope in Yorkshire in 1832, taken by Henry Hunt MP. She actually made the grounds that one of her grounds for requesting the right to vote was the fact that she, as a wealthy widow, paid tax, and she felt she should have representation. So tax was in there from the very beginning as one of the reasons why women should have the vote. As the 1800s progressed, we had the mass petition in 1866 and then endless petitions after that, petition after petition. In 1870, the Priestman sisters, who were Quakers, hit upon the idea of resisting their taxes. With their Quaker background, they didn't want to do militant action, but the idea of passive resistance appealed and fitted with their kind of worldview. And they resisted their taxes, and they had their dining tables and chairs distrained, taken to pay the tax, and taken to the auction. And what happened was someone paid their tax before the auction happened. So they thought, okay, we'll try again next year. And they tried again next year, and the same thing happened. So after that, they stopped because they didn't feel that it was fair for this unknown person to pay for their taxes. However, the idea didn't die a death. In 1884, Henrietta Muller, who was educated at Girton, she resisted her taxes. She made a big song and dance about it. Her furniture was seized from her house in Cadogan Place. And the newspapers were very unsupportive of her actions and sort of wrote about her as being just a silly woman. But as the turn of the century happened in the 1900s, in 1903 you get the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU is set up. There starts to get increasing militancy, and tax also starts to come on the horizon. The Liberals won their landslide in 1906, and then in 1909 Lloyd George does his very famous notable People's Budget, where he proposes putting taxation up and looks to kind of redistribute a more redistributive budget. At the same time as that is happening and bringing tax up in the national consciousness anyway, the various women's bodies are starting to think about resistance as a way forward. The Women's Freedom League sprang out of the WSPU in 1908, and they broke away, a group of about 70 or 80 women who didn't support the militant actions of the WSPU. They weren't prepared to endanger property or life in their campaigning. And for them, again, tax resistance appealed. It was a constitutional, rational basis on which to argue for your vote, and it didn't involve hurting property or people. A number of the Women's Freedom League members were resisting their taxes individually, and they decided in 1909 that it would be a good idea to get together and actually make this a group endeavour. As I say, at that time, tax was on the agenda because Lloyd George had done his budget. It was then rejected by the House of Lords, and he sent his ministers out in the summer of 1909 to go and talk about the budget and try and sell it to the people. And all these ministers were pursued by suffragettes, howling them down. And so tax was just suddenly, this was the moment on which to take a stand. And then 22nd of October 1909, a group of 24 women gathered, and one man, mustn't leave him out, gathered together to discuss forming a specific individual body solely for the purposes of the tax resistance. They'd initially considered being part of the Women's Freedom League, but 3 of the women there subscribed enough funds that they could set up on their own as a separate society. They were predominantly professional women. There was a lot of doctors, and there were also artists, writers, and Ethel Ayres Purdy, our First Lady accountant, who we'll come to later.